On November 25, 1945, 6 months after Nazi Germany's surrender, something unthinkable began in the cold Atlantic waters off the coast of Northern Ireland. British destroyers and Polish warships formed a grim procession, escorting not enemies, but Ghosts 116 German U-boats sailing toward their final destination. These weren't battle casualties. They were war prizes, technological marvels that had terrorized Allied shipping for 6 brutal years, now condemned to vanish beneath the waves in one of history's most classified naval operations. Operation Deadlight wasn't just about sinking submarines. It was about erasing evidence, burying secrets, and ensuring that certain technologies and certain missions would never be scrutinized, never be questioned, never see the light of day again. But what were the Allies truly hiding in those dark waters? Why did they choose obliteration over examination? And why, decades later, do some of these wrecks remain off-limits, their locations marked as restricted zones in naval charts? The official story speaks of military necessity and treaty obligations. The truth, submerged 500 feet below the surface, tells a far more disturbing tale. What cargo did some of these U-boats carry in their final weeks? What orders were given to certain crews that have never appeared in any war tribunal? And why did the Allies move with such urgent secrecy to destroy submarines they had spent years trying to capture intact? This is the story of Operation Deadlight, the mission that was never meant to be questioned, the submarines that were never meant to be found, and the secrets that powerful nations agreed should sleep forever in the Irish Sea. When Germany signed the instrument of unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the Kriegsmarine Hitler's once formidable navy faced an unprecedented crisis of obsolescence. Over 150 U-boats, ranging from the obsolete type to coastal submarines to the revolutionary Type 21. Electroboot that could travel submerged at 20 knots, suddenly found themselves without purpose, without nation, and without future. These vessels represented not just military hardware, but the culmination of desperate innovation submarines, equipped with snorkel technology that allowed them to remain submerged for weeks, acoustic torpedoes that hunted ships by sound, and in some cases, experimental cargo holds designed for missions that remain partially classified even today. The surrender terms were explicit and unforgiving. According to the Potsdam Agreement and the specific protocols established by the Tripartite Naval Commission composed of American, British, and Soviet representatives, all German naval vessels were to be divided among the Allied powers or destroyed. Yet this seemingly straightforward disposition concealed profound disagreements, strategic anxieties, and a race against time to secure or eliminate technologies that could shift the post-war balance of power. The Soviet Union wanted these submarines intact, desperately hungry for German engineering secrets that could modernize their aging fleet. The United States secured several prized specimens, including U-505, which had been captured a year earlier in a daring operation off the coast of West Africa and was now providing invaluable intelligence on German encryption and torpedo guidance systems. The British, however, advocated for wholesale destruction, and their position would ultimately prevail in what became known as Operation Deadlight. The decision to scuttle the majority of Germany's submarine fleet was announced in the autumn of 1945, though planning had begun months earlier in hushed conferences at the Admiralty in London. The official justification centered on practical concerns. Maintaining such a large fleet was prohibitively expensive. The submarines posed environmental hazards if left to deteriorate in ports, and there were legitimate fears that these vessels might fall into the hands of emerging nationalist movements or be scavenged for parts that could enable future submarine programs in nations the Allies sought to contain. Yet beneath these reasonable explanations lay darker considerations. British naval intelligence had compiled extensive dossiers on certain U-boat missions conducted in the war's final months. Operations that involved not combat patrols but transport runs to South America, Norway, and even potentially Japan via the Arctic route. Some of these submarines had departed Germany carrying high-ranking Nazi officials, looted treasury gold, advanced technical documents, and in whispered rumors that naval historians still debate, experimental weapons materials including components for Germany's nascent atomic research program. The Type 9 U-boats, with their extended range of over 13,000 nautical miles and cargo capacity far exceeding combat submarines, were particularly suited for such missions. U-234, for instance, had surrendered to American forces in May 1945 while en route to Japan, carrying 560 kilograms of uranium oxide, infrared fuses, jet aircraft designs, and 2 Japanese naval officers who committed ritual suicide rather than face capture. If one submarine carried such cargo, how many others had attempted similar missions? And more troublingly, how many had succeeded in delivering their loads to secret locations before the surrender? The British selection of Loch Ryan in Scotland, and later the deeper waters northwest of Ireland, near Malin Head, as scuttling sites was not arbitrary. These locations offered depths exceeding 500 feet, sufficient to ensure the submarines would be irretrievable with 1940s technology and would deteriorate rapidly in the cold, corrosive Atlantic waters. More importantly, these sites were remote from major shipping lanes and civilian observation, allowing the operation to proceed with minimal press coverage or public scrutiny. The submarines designated for Operation Deadlight were first gathered at Lissahallie near Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where they underwent a curious preparation process. Royal Navy personnel stripped the U-boats of remaining ammunition, fuel, and according to several declassified reports conducted thorough searches of crew quarters, cargo holds, and even welded compartments that had been sealed by German crews before surrender. What these British inspection teams were seeking has never been fully disclosed. But the searches delayed the scuttling schedule by several weeks and resulted in the mysterious removal of certain submarines from the Deadlight list. U-977 and U-530, both of which had famously sailed to Argentina after the European War ended, were spared destruction and instead handed over to the United States for extended technical examination. Their crews had surrendered months after Germany's capitulation, claiming they had been unaware of the surrender or had feared Soviet captivity. But Argentine naval records and witness testimonies suggested they had spent considerable time near remote coastal areas before turning themselves in, leading to persistent speculation about cargo offloading. The actual destruction phase of Operation Deadlight began on November 25, 1945, and would continue sporadically until February 12, 1946. The method was deliberately brutal British destroyers and polished naval vessels, operating under Royal Navy command, would tow the U-boats into designated zones and then either shell them with deck guns until they sank or use them for torpedo practice. Some submarines went down quickly, their pressure hulls ruptured by explosive shells or aerial bombing from RAF Coastal Command aircraft. Others proved remarkably resilient, remaining afloat despite dozens of direct hits, their robust German engineering evident even in death. Type 7 U-boats, which had formed the backbone of Donets's Atlantic wolfpacks, typically succumbed within an hour of sustained bombardment. The larger Type 9 submarines, however, often took 3 or 4 hours to sink, their double-hulled construction and compartmentalized design allowing them to absorb tremendous punishment. In several documented cases, U-boats had to be finished off with depth charges or torpedoes because surface gunfire proved insufficient. The Royal Navy's official reports describe these sinkings in clinical terms: target practice, ordnance, expenditure, and successful scuttling operations. But the sailors who participated in Operation Deadlight left very different accounts in letters and diaries that have surfaced over the decades. Many expressed profound unease at the task, describing it as execution rather than disposal, and several noted strange observations that were never included in official reports. Multiple crew members from HMS Onslaught, one of the primary destroyer escorts during Operation Deadlight, reported seeing U-boats that appeared to have been deliberately damaged before being towed out for sinking. welding burns on hull plates, hastily sealed hatches, and in one instance, scorch marks inside a conning tower visible through an open hatch suggested that some submarines had been subjected to more than routine decommissioning. A Polish naval officer, writing in his private journal, now held in the Sikorsky Institute archives in London, described boarding U-3503, a Type 21 electroboot scheduled for scuttling, and finding the radio room stripped not just of equipment but of mounting brackets and even wiring conduits, as though someone had wanted to ensure no trace of its communications capability remained. Even more intriguing was his observation that the submarine's logbooks and navigation charts were absent, despite British regulations requiring that all such documents be preserved for war crimes, investigations, and historical record. When he inquired about this discrepancy, he was curtly informed that the materials had been previously secured by naval intelligence and told to focus on preparing the vessel for towing. These irregularities were not isolated incidents. Of the 116 U-boats ultimately scuttled during Operation Deadlight, at least 30 showed evidence of pre-scuttling internal damage or unexplained modifications. According to an internal Royal Navy audit conducted in 1947 but not declassified until 1997, and even then with heavy redactions, the strategic implications of Operation Deadlight extended far beyond simple disposal of war materials. In the emerging Cold War context, the Soviet Union viewed the mass destruction of German submarines as a deliberate Anglo-American effort to deny them access to advanced naval technology. Stalin had expected to receive at least 50 U-boats as part of the war reparations agreed upon at Yalta and Potsdam. But through various bureaucratic maneuvers and the accelerated pace of Operation Deadlight, the Soviets ultimately received only a handful of aging vessels, none of which were the coveted Type 21 or Type 23 submarines that represented quantum leaps in underwater warfare capability. This perceived betrayal contributed to deteriorating relations between the wartime allies and fueled Soviet determination to develop their own advanced submarine fleet through captured German engineers and espionage. The British, meanwhile, had secured several Type 21 submarines before Deadlight commenced, quietly transferring them to Royal Navy facilities for exhaustive testing that would inform their own post-war submarine development program. The United States took possession of U-2513 and U-3008, both Type 21 boats, which became the basis for the tank-class submarines that would define American underwater warfare in the 1950s. The deliberate destruction of the remaining Type 21 submarines through Operation Deadlight thus served a dual-purposely meaning potential rivals access to German technology while ensuring Anglo-American naval supremacy in the post-war order. Yet the technological competition explanation, while significant, does not fully account for the urgency and secrecy surrounding certain aspects of Operation Deadlight. Why, for instance, were several U-boats sunk in designated zones significantly deeper than the majority, requiring special towing arrangements and the use of specific coordinates that remain classified in Admiralty archives? Why were civilian salvage companies warned, through informal but unmistakable channels, that attempting to locate or recover Operation Deadlight wrecks would result in prosecution under the Official Secrets Act? It's a threat that extended decades beyond any reasonable security concern. And why did the Royal Navy conduct follow-up surveys of the scuttling sites in 1948, 1953, and 1967? Deploying increasingly sophisticated sonar equipment that seemed designed not merely to confirm the wrecks' locations, but to monitor them for signs of disturbance. These questions gained new resonance in the 1980s when commercial fishing vessels operating northwest of Malin Head began reporting sonar contacts with large metallic objects at depths and locations consistent with Operation Deadlight sites, yet were warned by the Irish Naval Service, acting on British government requests, to avoid those areas due to unexploded ordnance hazards. The official explanation that U-boats might still contain live torpedoes or mines was plausible, but raised an obvious question. If the submarines posed such dangers, why hadn't they been properly cleared before scuttling? And why were some sites apparently more hazardous than others? The human dimension of Operation Deadlight has been largely overshadowed by its technological and strategic aspects. Yet it was the German submariners themselves who carried the deepest secrets into the post-war years. By the time the scuttling operation began, most U-boat crews had been processed through Allied POW camps, interrogated by naval intelligence officers, and either repatriated to occupied Germany, or in some cases, retained for extended questioning. The interrogation records from this period, partially declassified over the past 3 decades, reveal a systematic effort to reconstruct the final missions of every U-boat, with particular attention to vessels that had operated in the war's closing months. Crews were questioned not just about tactical operations, but about cargo manifests, passenger lists, unusual orders from Kriegsmarine Command, and any knowledge of evacuation or transport missions. The interrogators were especially interested in Type 9 U-boats that had departed Germany between February and April 1945, a period when the Atlantic War was effectively lost, but when certain submarines continued to Sochi, despite the futility of combat operations. Several crew members, speaking decades later in oral history projects, described missions that never appeared in official Kriegsmarine records. Transport runs to Norway carrying civilian passengers, identified only as technical specialists, orders to rendezvous with surface vessels at coordinates far from any combat zone, and in at least 3 cases, instructions to proceed to designated locations and await further orders that never came, leaving the submarines to wander the Atlantic until fuel exhaustion forced their return or surrender. The most tantalizing accounts came from crews of U-boats that had been designated for secret missions under the command of Admiral Donitz himself. Operations that bypassed normal Kriegsmarine command structure and were coordinated directly through a small office in the Kiel Naval Base known only by its bureaucratic designation: Special Operations Coordination Naval Transport. This office, whose records were either destroyed in the final days of the war or seized by Allied intelligence and never made public, apparently managed missions that had nothing to do with commerce, raiding, or anti-shipping warfare. One former crew member of U-534, a Type IXC U-boat, sunk in the Kattegat Strait on May 5, 1945. During its surrender voyage, claimed in a 1990s interview that his vessel had been loaded with sealed cargo containers at Kiel in late April. Containers that crew members were forbidden to inspect and which were guarded by armed SS personnel during loading. The submarine was to proceed to Norway, ostensibly for a standard patrol, but the crew suspected their true mission was to deliver the containers to a remote fjord where shore parties were waiting. The mission was aborted when Germany surrendered, and U-534 was caught by RAF aircraft while trying to reach Allied forces. When the submarine was raised from the seabed in 1993, investigators found evidence of the cargo containers, but their contents had long since been removed or dissolved, leaving only mounting brackets and cryptic stencil markings that included alphanumeric codes matching no known Wehrmacht inventory system. U-534 was not part of Operation Deadlight, having sunk before the operation commenced, but its cargo mystery cast long shadows over questions about what other U-boats might have been carrying and why. British authorities might have been so determined to ensure certain vessels were destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery or examination.